Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good morning to all of you. There are some latecomers, so take a seat. We will be starting the first session of the day. We'll be talking about a topic, a very topical issue towards a new economy of scarcity. We have an international panel of specialists to address this question. I'm François Vidal. I'm in charge of Les Echos, the editor-in-chief of Les Echos. I will moderate this roundtable with Kathleen Schubert from the Cercle des Economistes. And without further ado, I will pass on the torch to her. She will introduce the topic. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So if we want to revive hope, we need to identify the problems and issues to be sorted out. So the question that is being raised is that of scarcity. Economists have been pondering over this question for quite a long time. It's very simple. Is it possible to grow indefinitely with a finished planet whose resources are almost finished? So the economists have been pondering over this issue for quite a long time, and they came up with an answer. For resources with merchant resources, it's possible when you have resources that are scarce, such as oil, then prices are up. And when prices are up, it means that people will turn to substitution products. So agent companies would like to substitute these resources that are expensive and scarce. New technologies make it possible to replace them. So this happens when scarcity is there. For non-merchant goods, you don't have a price effect. So you have to take into account the economic policy. You have the carbon budget. So no shortage effect will increase prices. So the economy has to step in. Moreover, will it be the case forever? For energy, I think that there might be alternatives, because we can use sun. Sun is with us, and sun will be with us all the time. So solar energy will be able to replace the sources of energy. So it's possible. So we have to consider the living resources. So the ecosystems, biodiversity, and they are being shrunk. So how can we handle that question? I think that the economists and society as a whole have a lot to do. So this is the first point that I wanted to highlight. The second point that I would like to raise is the distribution of efforts. When you enter a world where scarcity is rampant, especially for the economy, we have to deploy some efforts in terms of innovation, energy frugality, efforts in terms of substitution of economic policies. So how do we share that within the countries, but also at the international level? All people in a country don't have the same ability to make those efforts. All countries cannot make some efforts. Some countries are less accountable and responsible than others, because we are in a world characterized by scarcity. So we have to come up with solutions, methods, policies in order to share those efforts in an equitable, in a fair fashion. So this won't be easy, I think. Thanks a lot for setting the stage, Catherine. So to my left, Veronika Grimm. You are a member of the German Council of Economic Experts and specializing in energy. Then Simon Manley. To Veronika Grimm's left, you are the ambassador of the UK and the permanent representative to the WTO for the UK. Ken Shibuzawa, the Chief Executive Officer of Shibuzawa Company from Japan, Christophe Bavière. You are the president of the Euraseo company, and Yannick Jeannot, we don't need to introduce him, the Green member of the European Parliament, and he was a candidate at the French presidential elections in 2022. Before we get down to the nitty-gritty, I will go around the table. I will ask the speakers a question. It's a kind of generic question. At the end of the day, you are specialists in those topics. So are you optimistic about our ability to design this new economic framework compatible with the planet limitations in order to mitigate the negative impacts of our economy? Veronica, floor is yours.
So I think we are in a very challenging situation. So the energy crisis hit the European Union, and the war of aggression against Ukraine hit Europe. In a situation where we're in the middle of a transition, basically, it has accelerated the transition. For example, in Germany, it accelerated the will to expand on renewables a lot because we had not the alternative of fossil gas anymore to the extent that we thought we would have it. In all over Europe, I think we face the massive challenge now to deal with the supply scarcities, with the supply risks also in terms of energy. And in a way, we have to tackle this challenge by cooperating more on energy in a situation where we have very different transformation paths. So in France, there's a plan to build up nuclear, and in Germany, we have to build up hydrogen-fired gas power plants in order to complement the renewables that are installed at the moment. So it's very different transformation paths. I think we have to seek for more cooperation and also to seek for social balance in this situation that is very challenging for the European Union. And one last issue that I want to emphasize is that in Europe we have a very special situation. We are very integrated in international value chains. The US is getting more capacities back to the US. In Europe, I think we should make an advantage out of this situation, that we are integrated in global value chains and can, of course, increase resilience also by diversifying our value chains and decreasing the dependencies that we still have, for example, on China.
Merci beaucoup, Véronica.
Thanks a lot, Veronica. I'm quite sanguine. I'm quite optimistic. We have to be optimistic. We need to deliver a positive vision as citizens, as governments, as companies. We have to be optimistic. We can change the future. So I listen to different people. I listen to different employees, young employees in the UK. So I need to be optimistic, and I'm optimistic. But we need to act quickly. Ken, what do you think of that? Ken Shibuzawa, what do you think of that?
Thank you very much for the invitation to this wonderful conference. I'm sorry I don't speak any French, but looking at the audience, I'm probably about the only Japanese. I'm in scarcity, so looks like this is a good topic for me to speak about. I am optimistic. The reason why is that if you think about it, in our planet, there are apparently 1.75 million living organisms. I'm sorry? Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry about that. So apparently in this planet, there's 1.75 million living organisms that's categorized, and there's 8.7 living organisms still to be yet unknown. And if you think about it, we human beings are only one species on the planet capable of bringing destruction to the planet. So given that, why am I optimistic? Well, of all the living species in the world, we are the only species on this planet that can be optimistic. Why? Because we're the only species that have imagination. And so if you think about it, Imagination and optimism is a state of mind in the face of reality. And this is one thing that I think we can leave for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. And so in effect, that's why I'm optimistic. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Christophe Bavière.
Alors, François, ta question pose...
Christophe Bavière. So optimism, this is what is at stake here. We have no choice but to be optimistic, and we don't need to raise this issue. I represent an investment fund. When you invest, you have to be sanguine. You have to be optimistic. So if you are not optimistic, don't invest. Of course, I'm quite optimistic. Why? Have a look at the investment funds and the situation they've faced. Any investment decision, such as an investment fund like ours, but others as well, take into account non-financial considerations, i.e. ESG considerations regarding society and corporate governance of investments. And if you consider Euraseo, the Euraseo fund, any investment decision will be subjected to non-financial filters. We have some exclusion sectors, and we have some sectors where we can improve. And have a look at what has happened over the past 20 years. So, but I'm optimistic. But if we consider our investment strategy, whether you finance a startup, a big company, whether it is financed by debt, by capital, whether you are in the infrastructure business, we want to succeed. But there's a risk. Of course, we need to build up or engineer a fund based on the limits of the planet, i.e. An impact-related fund. Then we'll see if we finance a startup, whether use a debt or capital. Are we going to fund or finance SMEs? So that's a question, but we can be optimistic and we can move ahead. Mr. Jadot, what do you think of that? Optimistic. If you look at the awareness-raising process amongst the citizens, optimistic. If you have a look at the quality of science, optimistic. If we look at innovation capacity and the current innovations, optimistic, because young people are very mobilized. But I won't stay there. 1,000 billion euros in different things, 600 billion euros in terms of investments in intensive farming, 300 billion in industrial fishing. So the sequence of events is not good. We have a kind of machine. We have some inertia in terms of decision-making, in terms of public policies. And this is inconsistent with the objectives and goals that we need to achieve. So I will be very short. We can talk about water scarcity, biodiversity scarcity. We can talk about the scarcity of the carbon stock that we have if we want to avert climate chaos. But there are two types of scarcity. Time scarcity, first. We need to act massively, swiftly, now. And there's a scarcity among political leaders because we are not up to the job. We politicians have a look at the climate policies. So remember what Mr. Gutierrez said, the UN director. I think that we've denied the sense of urgency, and that's not good. That's why I'm not really optimistic on this front. So, are people's minds mature for the necessary changes? You talked about fossil energies and subsidies that were paid to the fossil energy, but there might be a lack of political will. But what about the populations? Are they ready? The populations of the developed countries, socially, there's a problem because it's very difficult for people to accept the required and necessary measures. You know the allegory of a frog. When you want to boil it, you put the frog into hot water, it will escape. You put a frog into cold water, and if you boil water slightly, the frog will be used to the temperature and will end up totally boiled. So remember what Lester Brown has said, the Pearl Harbor movement. At the end of the day, we need to move away from a denial position, and we mobilize all the people. It was the case after Pearl Harbor, so we turned to the living forces of society in order to build a model. So this is the optimistic stance. Of course, you don't need to be a giant in terms of regulations. That's important, but that's not enough. We need to invest and we need to help out. In France, we have a problem, an issue with low emission areas. It's not because we've put a regulation. It's because we haven't created enough collective transportation networks. And of course, we support a policy whereby cars are cheaper. So as part of our model, in our companies at the international level, the most vulnerable people should win the day regarding green transition. There are lots of transformations. There are lots of in-depth changes. So, in fact, there's a kind of united front based on denial. So, at the European level today, we are currently voting on the text, the restoration of nature, and you have the Christian Democrats, the right-wing parties, they were instrumental in the construction of the European Union. It was a big movement. They've been pro-European, and they decided not to negotiate. They don't want to negotiate, and they have a motto of the far right: no feminist, no migrant, no environmentalists. So there's a kind of vertigo. People are afraid. People are scared about the future. Climate shocks, pandemics, inequalities, wars, and all the rest of it. And all people are scared, and people are also afraid of the past. So there's a sense of denial. It's a kind of regressive nostalgia. So the disasters are there. The transformations are there. And those who call the shots, the political leaders, they want to set aside ecology because they've said we are not in a position to shoulder our responsibilities regarding ecology. So mindsets are ready, but people are throwing up the towel. People are used to climate change, and they are resigned. So people think that public policies are powerless, and this is our worst enemy. And once again, ecology, environment, could be based on the relocation of economy, focusing on circular economy, on rural areas, focusing on districts, neighborhood, focusing on food, health, and countryside. And all these issues should enable us to lift up our company, and we could be reconciled with the future. This is the basis of democracy. Without democracy, there is no future. Regarding public policies now, Simon Manley, what can you tell us about the UK, the situation of the UK? That's quite interesting. I do agree with you. There's a tension between the will of the citizens, shareholders, investors. They want to change. And how can we do that? How can we achieve that objective? I'm quite optimistic. I will give you the example. The renewable energy sector, the offshore wind energy. There was a political will, that's important, but it's not enough. So what have we done in the UK? We have implemented a regulatory, financial, legislative framework that will bolster investments in this sector. It's a strong sector in our economy. It's a robust one. And there's a supply chain, there's a logistics chain in some port cities, the port cities that are underprivileged. And in fact, they create jobs, and people were very hopeful. And that's very good because people had lost confidence and trust in the politicians. That's why I'm optimistic. There are lots of options in terms of green economy. As citizens, as governments, as companies, we can change the future. So in the UK, there are some tensions regarding the low emission areas and zones in London. Yes, you're right. True. It's not easy. The situation is not easy because we are going through a crisis, economic crisis, a social crisis, but we need to cast a future-oriented eye. So who else would like to chip in, or can we move to the next question? So Ken, just turning to you. So Yannick Jadot said that public policies, should be implemented. And there's a question. The current capitalist system, can it meet the climate needs and the economy of scarcity? So Ken, what do you think of that?
Before I get into that subject, let me just talk about the origins of capitalism in Japan. Actually, it was learned from France. The reason is 156 years ago, my grandfather's grandfather, his name was Eiichi Shibusawa, landed on the shores of Marseille and attended the Paris Exposition in 1867 as part of the mission sent by the brother of the last shogun of Japan. That's where he learned capitalism. Brought it back to Japan, started about 500 companies, 600 social enterprises, hence he's known as the father of Japanese capitalism. But his philosophy was integrating morality with business. And the reason why he did that was, I believe, it was for sustainability. And to do that, he was a champion of the human capital. He was a growth man, but he was mostly, I believe, in terms of human capital development. Unfortunately, in Japan, people didn't listen to him, I think, because there was the unfortunate eras of the World War II, and things got really messy. But after the post-war period, actually Japan did very well with capitalism. But this time, that capitalism is based on mass consumption of the advanced nations of the world with good mass production. We were so successful, that a lot of bashing happened to us back then. But that model is over in Japan, and the current prime minister in Japan is talking about the new form of capitalism. Now, he is a growth person. He wants growth, but that growth, he believes, has to be in a virtual cycle with distribution. And that's his message. I believe the press is not really reporting on the more core thinking of his policy. He stated in public as well in the UK and also in Japan, but the press for some reason doesn't pick it up. It's basically saying he wants to integrate the externalities left behind by capitalists. And what are externalities? It's the environment and it's a society. And so what I believe he's trying to do is to new form of capitalism in our present day language would be inclusive form of capitalism. And how do you do that? Again, I think you need human capital development, and that's the key message that I think he brings. And so basically, I think we need to go with the new form of capitalism, with the inclusive form of capitalism, is I think the key word of scarcity. Scarcity has to have value. It's basic economics, and I think that's the road that we need to be taking. Finally, in Japan, there are two sensibilities that the Japanese like to take to heart. And I just want to share that with you. One is versus nature. In Japan, we feel nature shouldn't be conquered, but rather people should cohabit with nature. That's one. There's another saying in Japan that's really well regarded by a lot of people, and this is called in Japanese taru o shiru, which means be content with what you have. And frankly, in the modern Japanese society, we're forgetting this, but I think we need to remember this.
Très bien, merci beaucoup. Alors, Yannick Jadot, je me retourne prolongement à la question.
Jadot, I turn to you again. Degrowth, is it the only solution to adapt to the new climate stakes and challenges? Is that the answer? Well, for me, degrowth, and that's how it was conceived, is a concept that helps to understand what growth is. It can't be an objective as such, it's meaningless. Today, we saw that there was a nice committee of Nobel Prize winners set up by President Sarkozy that said to what extent we needed new indicators of collective perspective. Today we look at the growth of the GDP without considering, the distribution, how the territories are organized. I prefer to talk of where we invest and what's important. I said that earlier. We see today climate is a battle. It's a war. We're not going fast enough now. The momentum is not good. We're not mobilized enough. We don't do everything we should. And what's happening in the background is an economic war. An economic war around technologies and the industries that will serve or can serve this battle for climate. We see the Chinese are investing massively on these energies, on electric vehicles, on renewable energies, hydrogen, so on and so forth. We see the U.S., the Americans, through investment, $370 billion proposed by Biden to force or to help the American industry on that. And we see Europe, which is a giant in terms of regulations, which historically in all international negotiations has been behind the cause of climate more than anybody else. And that is today losing the economic battle. It means that we are not investing. When we look at European promises in terms of investments, there are budgets that have not been spent that we recycle indefinitely. We don't even have a Buy European Act to privilege on European markets local productions, European productions that we consider as strategic. The public markets in Europe represent 1,800 billion euros per year. All our partners do it, and we don't do it. We don't privilege the European market. We haven't set up the economic machine that could respond to this. And the last point, if I may, is our climate economy cannot be done with the detriment of the rest, at the detriment of the rest of the world. I see Mr. Severino, who's part of the people who've taught me sensitivity to the world, and particularly be sensitive to Africa. If the construction of our development of our renewable energies and of all our technologies is done on the back of people in Congo, with everything's happening in that country, on water, for example, in Argentina, on the back of human rights. In the end, the countries of the South that contributed the least would become our backyard with a new mode of extractiveness, which is as bad as what we did with oil or coal. And this is why the question is not degrowth. The question is sobriety. We cannot simply accept the idea that to transform our mobility, we just need to transform a SUV, a thermal SUV, and an electric SUV. That the green airplanes is fine. It's great to innovate, but we shouldn't. If we don't, put in question the way we live and travel, that's the issue. If we don't invest on the thermal renewal of housing, for example, insulation. So we have to work. I think degrowth is a bad debate. We have to work on sobriety. We have to work, otherwise we will keep on going with the world of the past and not evolve. So to react on what you said about Europe, you said that Europe had not implemented enough means to trigger the machine. But what we hear a lot, we've been hearing that for a while, is that it has set up or voted a lot of rules which are obstacles for companies, for enterprises. But it's the worst case. that's even worse. Since we don't set up the conditions to succeed and to mobilize the people. And that's what I call an ecology of constraints, which forces us to avoid the obstacles. So we've established rules on the diesel, for example, Dieselgate. We voted rules on air pollution, on many things. We vote rules or regulations, but if we don't take or add the accompaniment, the social accompaniment, if we don't do that, if we don't carry out the necessary investments, we'll just fail. Look at our European companies and dealers and companies. They say, okay, we're going to earn so much money in the US. You take a French company who works on renewable energies, and they set up in the north of France, for example. With their project, they would collect 1.5 billion in the US, 200 million in Europe. So it's not a question of spending or wasting public funds, but what I mean is that if we don't do the same as in the US, well then the rule is no longer the objective. We don't have the conditions of a social accompaniment to ensure success, but the rule is only a constraint. And in today's world, nobody wants constraints anymore. So the idea of an environmental break, as it is stated by some European countries, is a fault. When you think of the timing on the battles we should fight for the environment, so we shouldn't again abandon the constraints, but we should mobilize and not only impose constraints. Okay, I think we understand that financial means are at the heart of this shift, of this transition. So I turn to you, Christian Bavière, who is the specialist in this roundtable of financial topics. So in the end, question we want to ask you, do we have the financial means? Can the private sector be a relay of the public action to multiply the necessary investments? Well, it's a very good question, because Yannick Jadot has just expressed that clearly. Public investments must work, but also private investments must also play their role. I represent investment funds. It works, Euraseo. Look at what happened in the last 20 years. We had a digital transition to finance, to fund. And our economy was not really digital, but then now we open our bank account with our smartphone. So our economy has turned digital. And it happened with a different way of functioning, of operating. In the end, digital evolution has expressed itself more easily in startups and smaller companies than in traditional companies. So what we can note from this example is that industry, private industry, investment funds, well, they've adapted. There was no industry of financing or innovation in Europe 20 years ago. Today there is. So the question is the investment funds, can they adapt to a specific need, urgent need, which is funding environmental transition, energy transition? So, but let's learn from the past. Why did the digitalization of industry why was it so strong in the U.S.? Because a very large part of private American savings, the money was invested in this sector, and us in Europe. And I'm talking what's happening in the private sector. We Europeans are lucky. We're very lucky. We are a developed economy. We have countries. Our populations are of a certain age, but in our countries there are a lot of savings. Okay, savings in the bank. But this private saving capacity, where is it invested today? It's invested in investment tools that are pasteurized. So if we did a survey in this room, how many in this room have part of their savings invested in energy transitions? That's a question. And clearly, what some of us, so it's really, really tiny. What the Americans did to fund or to finance the digital achievement, success. We can even talk, if we're not too naive in Europe, we can how do they finance the digital imperialism? By mobilizing very big amounts of private savings. In Europe, we have savings. We have awareness. People are aware. But what we shouldn't leave aside and fail on is that we do not mobilize our savings. Now a short comment on what facilitates the work of investment funds. Investment funds need that the regulatory framework help them. They need help from, they need public money. And if the French tech exists, it's because there was an investment bank, public investment bank in Europe that showed the way, snowball effect. But we need, us as investment funds, that the public authorities, the power, give us a clear indication, a clear path. And it's also propose a stable regulatory environment. Investing means being optimistic, and to invest you need stability. Europe has a lot of qualities. It can generate a lot of regulatory tax, sometimes too much, and they hinder stability, and this fragilizes private investments. And the last thing, I'm sorry, maybe I would put a cold spell here. Private investments finance the digitalization of the economy. Okay, because it yielded good financial performance, a good payback. But us, private funds, we can finance the energy transition. It was one of our requirements of our shareholders, but we don't manage our money. We manage the retirement funds of doctors, of physicians. So what we need is to demonstrate that there is a financial discipline when we're given money or entrusted money, and we tell our investors that we will invest in the energy transition. Well, we're talking 500 million euros. Is that enough? Not at all. So our objective is to start with the first fund of 500 million, then convince other investors. The next fund will be dedicated to the energy transition, but we need to be able to mobilize savings. We can do better in Europe to mobilize savings. So again, we need regulatory stability, and we need the investments we make to start the pump, to trigger the pump, yields a good financial performance, profitability. There's the payback. It's always a problem. Okay, before going back on this question, Veronica, I turn to you to talk about the issue of the financing efforts in emerging economies and the commitments of Western countries that are not always held or kept. They don't keep their commitments. Oui, je pense.
Funding. The funding is crucial. I think within Europe it's crucial to just mobilize private money, and also internationally it's crucial to mobilize private money. And I think we have the possibility through our interconnection in global value chains in order to give fundings, and we have to strengthen our situation, our position in this respect. In the European Union, I think we already are involved a lot. We do a lot. We negotiate in climate conferences and so on, but we don't direct our economic relations enough towards getting climate protection done together in the international community. We could do more. I think the debates about, for example, the Mercosur trade agreement shows it. So there are concerns because of the Amazon forest, of course, forest protection. But I think we have to do this cooperatively with the Southern American countries. The idea that we dictate how they have to deal with their forest is not a very good idea, because then we will not have a trade agreement at all. And then, for example, the Chinese will be involved much more in South America in the future than we are. And so I think we have to shift a little bit our policy direction towards cooperating on mutually attractive projects that sustain climate protection, for example, in Germany, because our transition passes so much via climate neutral gases. We have now a lot of negotiations on green hydrogen with countries worldwide, and this can generate an opportunity if we do it in a fair way, I think. So to give those countries the possibility to have benefits from it, if we involve in trade beyond green hydrogen, maybe in critical raw materials, and benefit from our interconnection in global value chains in order to make things going together with countries, and enable those countries also to do their growth on the basis of renewable energy and not on fossil energy. I think this is a problem that is often overlooked. We look at Europe very much when it comes to climate protection, but the vast majority of people does not live in Europe, and they also want growth. So our role is also to provide technology to enable those societies to grow in a sustainable way. I think we should fill this role more ambitiously.
Merci beaucoup. En deux mots, je vous ai vu réagir, Yannick Jadot. Peut-être.
Yannick Jadot, I saw your reaction. We're a little late to it. On the agreements with Mercosur, I'm sorry, but on the agreements with Mercosur, I don't see how more exports from Brazil, meat, soja, ethanol, and sugarcane, more exports of chicken, will all this contributing to deforestation can help the climate. Excuse me, but an agreement that's 20 years old since the beginning of this negotiation. Mercosur is 20 years old. So it's the equivalent of Spain and Portugal that has disappeared in terms of forestry. And this confirms an agro-exporting model, Brazilian model, and you look at the election map of Brazil, all the forestry specialists vote for Bolsonaro. I don't see how we can save the climate with such agreements. If we want to help Brazil, I think it's the climate funding schemes. We have to respect our commitments, help Brazil to protect its forests, but consider that we need, thinking that we need an agreement to destroy the forest and giving money to Brazil to do so, no, that can't work. That can't work anymore. And so I'll go back on the other element I wanted to talk about, the multilateralism. How can international organization contribute to help to tackle this subject? I think they have a very important role in this context to mobilize the necessary resources, financial resources for climate. But I will say, I want to add something. I listen every day. I hear my colleagues in developing countries, in Geneva, at the World Trade Organization, the UN, and too often they see the measures we take as Western countries, as Europeans, as protectionism measures, hidden protectionist measures. They see subsidies. Yannick mentioned that Americans give to their enterprises. They give enormous subsidies to their enterprise. Why don't we do the same? Why don't we give the same level of subsidies in Europe? Why do the rules of the WTO don't apply to the US? Why don't they apply to the US? And I think that's a major issue, because we will not win this battle for a greener future, neither with protectionism nor with a subsidy war between developing countries and Western countries. So we need to have a true, genuine collaboration policy between developing countries. Genuine collaboration with generosity on behalf of developed countries, but a collaboration in which we listen, we hear the demands and the needs of developing countries. Thank you. So we mentioned necessary investments, the means, but there's also another major issue that is energy transition. And so we see the efforts are being made everywhere. And Veronica Grimm, I'd like to ask you, are we on the right track? Do we have the right momentum? Are we going fast enough in terms of energy transition?
Are on the right track, but we are not fast enough. And this is basically due to the fact that we do not optimally cooperate within the European Union. So we have different transformation paths, and we, I think, have to give room to the different countries to follow their transformation paths faster. So all this struggle, I mean, France will need nuclear power. The Germans will need these hydrogen-ready gas power plants. And I think it's not very clever to hinder each other going that path, because we have no alternative. We have to transform our energy systems. And what was mentioned already is a very complicated regulatory framework. So we regulate everything very technology specific, very much into the detail, whereas, for example, in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, for hydrogen, it just gives tax credits for hydrogen in relation to the CO2 used. And this, of course, is much easier and much more easy to expect what benefits you can get. And so I think we have to become easier in our regulation. We have multiple systems that try to get the economy towards climate change. We have the European emission trading system, which is a good system, but not ambitious enough across all sectors. Mm-hmm. And then parallelly, we have a lot of regulation and programs that make it very complicated. And I think we can become faster. By the way, we put as much money on the table for climate change as the US does, if you compare the programs themselves. But the US programs are just so much easier to follow.
Oui, alors justement, oui, on touche un peu aux limites de l'Europe. Est-ce que vous...
And these are maybe the limits of Europe. Do you share this feeling, Yannick Jadot, as a European deputy? Well, energy is not a European competency. The Lisbon Treaty does not include energy in the European competencies. We rebuilt Europe on coal and steel, 1952, but in the end, it's sort of like a halfway competency. Europe decides on our objective in terms of renewable energy. Due to our objectives for the climate, Europe defines our objectives in terms of energy efficiency, so it constrains the national energy mixes, but those mixes are at the national level. And here we have to address the nostalgia, imaginary. The economic reality in Europe is that 95% of the new electricity production are renewable energy. They're much cheaper today, and you can deploy them much faster. Cheaper than coal due to the cost of carbon, cheaper than gas, and cheaper than the nuclear sector. But there you are addressing imaginaries that are very complicated. The imaginary of coal is extremely complex. Coal is social energy, and that's how the trade unions were developed in Europe. Coal represent territories, trades that are very hard, very difficult, that have a meaning. And Silesia, for example, to pull out that region from coal is a major political issue. It's not a question of technology. Nuclear energy in France, it's France, you know, taking its international role with the bomb and want to go back to the imaginary of the 70s. But objectively speaking, in our country, we will have the nuclear coexist with other energies for the next 25 years. But the only question that should be addressed rationally is today to fight against climate deregulation and to free ourselves from dependencies and create employment, jobs, and enterprise. What is the path to go for EPR plants? renewable energies, nuclear plants. Private sector is going on renewable energy. So here at the Cercle des Économistes, my choice is made. Thank you.
So we could talk about wind farms and social acceptance and all the rest of it. People don't want to have wind farms in their gardens. Time flies. I mean, we had lots of questions, maybe questions in the room, questions from the audience. Any questions? So is it possible to give people a mic? So in the third row, you have got the mic, so go ahead with your question.
Non, ça passe pas. Si vous parlez un peu plus fort, on vous entendra.
Oui, merci pour ces interventions.
So thank you for your comments. I'm an activist of Génération Écologie, so I do agree with Mr. Jato. There are two types of scarcity. If we have to consider the theme of this platform, two types of scarcity, time scarcity and scarcity in terms of political will and scarcity in terms of citizens' determination. So the growth is not an objective. Green growth can't be an objective because it leads to greenwashing for public policies and it leads to greenwashing for companies. And the growth will enable us to dampen growth. Can you put your question? Yes, I will put my question. You said that we cannot impose green growth to Africa and to other countries, and I think that they should be provided with a model of an economic society which is not based on overconsumption and on waste, because in France we waste 1/3 of our food resources and 1/3 of our industrial resources. It's a question for Mrs. Rim. So accounting is the universal language of the economy. Why don't we build at the European level, at a global level, an economic language accounting that is not based on material goods, but on intangible goods, immaterial goods, as we've said earlier? This is one of the topics that we wanted to address. Thanks a lot for your question.
Thank you very much for the question, which gives me the possibility maybe to clarify what I meant, because I think we have to be aware of the fact that in the industrialized Western countries, we are a minority of population. We are 12% of the world population. The rest lives elsewhere, and we cannot impose just rules on them. So they have their own wishes, for example, to get economic prosperity and growth. And I think we have to cooperate and to offer an attractive cooperative environment in order to get them with us into this transformation. I think we have no other chance. If you are in Brazil, and I've been there now and talking to the people there, and people there say, okay, if you don't have an agreement with us and we cooperate on getting a better future, then we will interact more with the Chinese. And this is definitely not what will save our forest and our environment. So I think we have to look also at the outside options, and we really have to struggle to fill our role and commit to responsibility in Europe in order to get the world on the right side of going into the direction of climate protection. I think it's not clear that we will manage this. We really have to struggle for it.
Merci beaucoup. En deux mots, Christophe Bavière sur ce sujet.
Juste peut-être pour rebondir sur ce que vous...
Christophe Bavière. So allow me to chip in. What you've said is very important. Accounting rules are the same in Europe, and for an investment fund, when we take into account an investment, the financial criteria are the same in Europe, and that's quite useful for us. So regarding non-financial criteria, it has nothing to do with standardization. If we want things to change in the world, data should be clear. So we conduct some carbon reviews, corporate carbon reviews, so we are better than in 2008 when we started, but it's nightmarish to conduct a carbon review for companies assigning non-financial objectives is key for us. So if you consider the demands of the public sector, it would be a good idea to get a framework for managing data, a framework for non-financial data. It would be good. We finance lots of managers, lots of entrepreneurs. These people want to get those criteria. So the public sphere, the regulatory sphere are in favor of that. And the entrepreneurs and the corporate leaders, they don't want to continue to pollute for the sake of it. They want to contribute. And they are suffering quite a lot. Of course, regarding your carbon balance, I mean, you need to trace your carbon balance, but it is quite complex and depends on the place where you live in. So today, some extra financial criteria should be stable, and these are requests that come from managers, entrepreneurs, and it's a source of hope. So I think that we've overshot our speaking time, and I will give the floor to Catherine, and Catherine will summarize this round table. So there's a red flag, so I will conclude. So it's a gigantic effort. It is not an ancillary type of transformation. There is hope around the corner, but we need to align finance, politics, society, and international cooperation. I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. Thanks a lot, Catherine. I'd like to thank all the speakers. Thanks a lot for being with us.